let me know when we're good to go. Good morning. So today, Sunday, December 6th, we're going to be talking about love your neighbor as the virtues of the month. This month we have the virtues of the month for December are love and charity. So we're going to put both of them together and we're going to talk about loving our neighbors. So we're going to start with our harmonization text, and it's from the book The Way, the Truth, and the Life, Caminho, Verdade e Vida. It's text number 41, and the title is The Golden Rule. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verse 39. Of course, Christ's ambassadors of his wisdom and mercy had already taught the golden rule many centuries before Jesus' coming. However, it is important to note that this principle was transmitted with a greater or lesser as an exemplification by its expositors. The Greeks used to say, "Do not do to your neighbor what you do not wish to receive from him." The Persians stated, "Do as you would like to have done to you." The Chinese declared, "Whatever you would not want for yourself, do not do to others." The Egyptians recommended, "Allow to pass the one who does to others what he would want for himself." The Hebrews taught, "Whatever you would not wish for yourself, do not do to your neighbor." The Romans insisted, "The law engraved on the human heart is to love members of society as you love yourself." In ancient times, every culture received the golden rule of Christ's magnanimity. Prophets, legislators, judges, and philosophers acted as instruments that were in tune to a lesser or greater degree with inspiration from the higher spheres of life. However, because what they came to reveal to people was only fragmentary, their names were stricken from the temples of initiation or were forgotten with time. With the Master, however, the golden rule is divine news because Jesus taught and exemplified it, not with partial virtues, but in the fullness of his work, his self-denial and his love for all humankind. Let us pray. Dear Father of immeasurable love, dear Jesus, our Master and older brother, dear spiritual mentors, we thank you for all the love you show us unconditionally. We thank you for all the efforts you put into helping make us better, into trying to guide us through the narrow door of virtues. We thank our guardian angel for their incessant help, for their perseverance, even or mostly when we are reluctant, when we rebel. We thank these angels for showing us their love through all the goodwill they have towards us. We thank our Father for all the blessings He showers upon us, even the ones we fail to recognize as blessings or as opportunities. We ask the spiritual guides of our home, FSS, to enlighten us during this simple talk today, so that hopefully some of the content will touch our hearts, and so that we may understand a little bit deeper the meaning of the golden rule. So be it. All right, so today, as we read in a harmonization text, we're going to talk about the passage, love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the golden rule, and it sounds simple enough. But how can we do that? How can we get there? These are simple words, and when we say those words out loud, it sounds like it's an easy enough task to accomplish. That is until somebody steps on our toes. Until somebody does something that sends us flying in rage or even just annoyed. At that point, it's not so easy to do unto others as we would like them to do unto us. So we're going to talk a little bit about the passage first and what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, or our neighbors as ourselves. And then we're going to talk about how we can try to accomplish that. And of course here neighbor is in the biblical sense. In Portuguese we say o próximo. And the word neighbor gives this idea of whoever is around you. So the passage, one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." So that's the first commandment. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And as we saw also in the harmonization text, this comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, and here it's verses 35 to 40. In the book Amor Imbatível Amor, or in a free translation, Love, Unbeatable Love, by Joana de Angelis, she says that love cannot be imposed, but developed, trained when it doesn't happen spontaneously. It sounds a bit weird to say that love can be trained, but it's actually fairly easy to understand when we think about not necessarily family relationships, but romantic or even friendships. Sometimes you meet a person, you don't love them immediately, right? You coexist, you have some kind of interaction with that person, and then as time goes by, we develop that feeling of love for the other person. So it's easier to understand if we think like this. The synthesis, or like the summary, so proposed by Jesus around love, is one of the most beautiful psychotherapies known to man. Love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself, in a harmonic trilogy. Trilogy here because we're talking about ourselves, our neighbors, and God. So that's why trilogy. And then Joanna continues to say, because it's impossible for men to fully love God, since they find it difficult to understand the absolute, because God is the absolute, and we find it difficult to understand. We're not at that level yet. A lot of us still have that idea of God in a human form, the anthropological God. So it's hard for us to understand the absolute. And how can we love completely or fully something that we don't understand? So we find it hard to understand the absolute. So we fulfill this need for inverting the order of the teaching, loving themselves or ourselves first in order to develop the abilities that are latent within them. Latent means sleeping, dormant. So we have love is a seed inside us, and it's up to us to plant it and to nurture it. Since we still don't understand God fully, we start by inverting the order. So we start first by loving ourselves, which is the closest. I'm the closest person to myself. Sounds obvious, but sometimes it isn't. So first, loving ourselves. Then we're going to develop the abilities for love that are that seed inside us. Growing towards loving their neighbor, a natural result of self-love. Once I learn how to love myself, once I learn and develop that love, once I fill myself with that love, that's going to overflow and extend to my neighbor. So as she says, it's a natural result of self-love. If I'm feeling good, I want those around me to feel good as well. If I'm happy, I want those around me to be happy. It's really difficult to be the only happy person surrounded by misery. So when we're happy, we want everybody around us to be happy and to share, to partake in our feelings. Because their neighbor is an extension of themselves. We live in a society. We don't live isolated. So my family is the closest cell to me. So having a miserable family, how can one person be happy in a family alone when nobody else is? So it's an extension of us because we live in a society. And finally, loving God as an incomparable transcendence in which love surpasses all other emotions and is responsible for all other actions. And this book hasn't been officially translated yet, so that was just a free translation done by me in the book Love, Unbeatable Love by Joanna Genesini, psychographed by Divaldo. So here, what Joanna is doing is, again, she's proposing that we invert the order in which Jesus said, because he said, love God above all things, love your neighbor as yourself. So he mentions first God, then our neighbors, then ourselves. And Joanna is explaining to us here that since we can't understand God fully, it's a whole lot easier to invert the order and start with ourselves. Once we develop the ability, because love is a virtue and needs to be developed, once we develop that ability and we fill ourselves with it, it overflows and extends to those around us, our neighbors. And as we develop the ability, we will eventually, as we evolve, learn to understand God. And then we will be able to love God above all things fully and not just in theory. So we've been talking about self-love here a few times and saying that everything starts with us, right? So everything starts with self-love. We need to learn ourselves first. I cannot give something that I don't have. So, what is to love ourselves? How do we love ourselves? Feeling that we are immortal spirits, we are God's children, and we are apprentices of life. So we've been talking a lot about this lately. Feeling as an immortal spirit. Every time we feel that this is it, YOLO, you only live once, it doesn't make sense to develop our virtues. So understanding and feeling that we are immortal spirits, because sometimes we, Spiritists or any reincarnationist of other religions, sometimes we forget that it's not YOLO, it's not just this. This is a result of all the past lives, and whatever comes afterwards, again, is going to be a result of the total. It's cumulative, both positive and negative. So, feeling like an immortal spirit, understanding that all my actions have consequences. So, feeling that I am God's child, feeling that I am not abandoned in the universe, that I wasn't born to suffer. Why has God done this to me? No, we are all God's children. The sun rises for the good and the ignorant. The rain falls for the bad and the good. So we are all God's children. We all have equal opportunities, not necessarily in the same existence, but throughout our lives. Once we are created, we are immortal. So throughout all of our existences, reincarnations, experiences, however you want to call it, we are all going to have the opportunities to go through the trials of beauty, of richness or wealth. We're all gonna go through all kinds of trials. So we all get, God will always, Divine Providence will always give us the opportunities that we need, just not in the same existence as everybody else. When we look at this existence, it's just a picture. It's not a movie, but our existence is a movie. So if we look just at this existence, we are ignoring everything that came before and everything that will come after. So feeling that we belong, that we are not here thrown in a universe, that we were not created to suffer or anything like that. God gives us the opportunity to evolve, and it's our own choices that will dictate how we live this existence and the following ones. And feeling like an apprentice of life. If we are here with our selfishness, with our pride, with our perfectionism, thinking that I'm better than a lot of people, or than everybody else, or than everyone in my family, or than everyone at work, how can we learn if we are already putting ourselves in a position of knowing everything? So feeling like an apprentice is essential, because even if I know that I am here to evolve, but I still have that prideful attitude of, I already know this, I'm much better than that person, so I'm good, I'm fine. How can we learn? If we're not humble enough, how can we learn? If we think we already know everything. So, since we've talked about self-love a lot lately, and we've just talked about all these three bullet points about what it is to love ourselves, now let's focus on reflecting on loving our neighbors. In question number 9, in the beginning of the Spirit's book, Kardec asks, what proof have we that the first cause of all things, God, is a supreme intelligence, superior to all other intelligence? So what proof do I have that God is the absolute, that God is above all else? How do we know? And then the answer is, you have a proverb that says, the workman is known by his work. Look around you, and from the quality of the work, infer or deduce that of the workman. So let's start with our own planet. Look at the perfection of ecosystems, of nature, of everything. Then let's extend it to our solar system, our galaxy, and the universe. So look at the quality of what God created and deduce for yourself if He is a supreme intelligence or not. So it's a very straightforward. So by deduction, we can reflect that if we can only understand God in our present evolutionary condition by His works, love should also come through His works. So learning to love through His works. And let's remember that we are His work too. And what is God's biggest work? We would love to say that humankind or ourselves or something like that. However, we need to think a few levels above. God's biggest work are actually the divine laws, because the divine laws rule the whole universe. The divine laws keep the whole universe in order. Even when it looks like chaos, there is an order to what we perceive as chaos. So His greatest work was the divine laws, because they apply to the whole entire universe. And we're talking about biological laws, moral laws, physical laws, all of them, because the whole universe is submitted to these laws. Everything that is created afterwards is going to fall under these laws. And what is the greatest law that we all know? It's the law of love, justice, and charity. So when we're looking at the law, the major law of love, justice, and charity, the dimension charity of the greatest law is practiced by loving our neighbors and doing unto our neighbors as we would have them do unto us, treating them the way we would like to be treated. Therefore, everything we do to ourselves and to others needs to go through the criteria of the major law, right? In Portuguese, we call it peneira da lei maior. So it's like sifting through it. And that is what will transform us into better people, and finally, truly good people, or spirits, always in evolution, always fulfilling the mission that God gave us, according to question 115, that we were all created ignorant, and God gave us all a mission, so that through that mission we will know the truth, which is the divine laws, and by knowing that, we will get closer to Him and reach our eternal happiness. So the mission that God gave us to know the truth and get closer to Him and be finally truly happy. So what is going through the major law criteria? It's asking ourselves 3 basic questions. For every action we have, mainly towards other people, but towards ourselves as well, every decision we make, we need to ask ourselves these 3 questions. The first, is this action loving to myself and everybody else? The second, is this fair to myself and everybody else? And is this charitable to myself and everybody else? And here we have loving, fair, charitable, the three dimensions of the major law. So we ask these three questions, and if the answer is yes to all three, it's loving, fair, and charitable, both to myself and to everybody else, to others, then definitely we should go on, we should proceed. Because in this case, we are connected to the divine within us. If the answer is no, we need to stop and make an effort to change our choices. If we're not sure, we can just switch positions, try to put ourselves in the other person's shoe or people's shoes, and ask ourselves, would I want that person or those people to do that to me? This should be fail-proof. If we're not finding excuses, if we're not masking some hidden egotistic feeling, if we're being true and sincere to ourselves, this should be fail-proof. If I would not want to receive my own action, then I have already answered those three questions. So, what do we need to do in order to do to others what we would have them do to us? Sometimes during the process of our evolution throughout time, we cultivate the egotistic feelings or matters instead of the essential ones. We worry about outside, exterior things. We concentrate in the wrong thing. And we go into a temporary state of subconsciousness that is characterized by the numbing of our own conscience. So like I said, we mask that feeling. When I ask myself, would I like to receive this action? I'm like, oh yeah, sure, I wouldn't mind. But this is only masked because of my desire to do that to the other person. It's not true, it's not sincere. It's just because I want to do that to that person. Then I fool myself, I numb my conscience, saying that, yeah, I wouldn't mind being at the receiving end of my own action. So we numb our own conscience, and then we allow selfishness to determine our relationship with others. We act selfishly because we are just masking our feelings. We're just numbing our conscience. So this connection with other people is characterized by dislove, which is a made-up word that doesn't exist in the dictionary, but I love English because it's a very flexible language. And this love causes us to feel either indifference or cruelty towards others. So, again, what do we need to do in order to do to others what we would have them do to us? We need to develop our conscience. Numbing our conscience will always lead to either cruelty or indifference. So back to that example. When I ask myself the three questions, is it loving, fair, charitable to myself? I can just quickly say yes, or even when I ask, would I like to be at the receiving end of my own action? And if I say, oh, yeah, I don't mind, sometimes what this is either cruelty, because I want that person to go through the action I want to impose on them, or it could be indifference. It could be, whatever, I don't really care about that person. So, developing our conscience. Question 621. Where are the divine laws written? In our conscience. They are there. But when we numb our conscience, convincing ourselves that it's fine, when we cover true virtues with pseudo virtues, we allow ourselves. So, pseudo love. In this example, we're talking about loving our neighbors. So it's what looks like it. To other people, it might feel like it, but it isn't. Then there's this love when it goes totally against love, but it's really obvious. So the pseudo love is the masked feeling, is the feeling that even I can fool myself thinking that I am being loving, fair, and charitable to that person when I'm really not. This love is very obvious. It's the obvious feeling of annoyance, of dislike, of hate, of repulsion. And the true virtue is love. And as we can see, we can notice that this love is closer to love than pseudo-love. Why? Because when we start masking our feelings, when we convince ourselves or others, mostly ourselves, that we are being loving, fair, and charitable to ourselves and everybody else, when we mask it, we go even further from the real feeling of love. Because if we keep masking it, if we keep pretending, numbing our conscience to think that our actions are love, our feeling, what we're developing is love, we can fool ourselves for much longer than when we feel dislove, because the contrast is bigger. It's easier for me to realize that I hate someone, that I'm angry at someone, that somebody annoys me. It's a lot easier for me to realize these feelings than for me to realize when I think, oh, but when I justify the other person's actions, but oh, he does it because that's all he knows what to do. Oh, he can't do any better. So when we disguise those feelings, we go further because it's harder to identify that they are not true feelings. While hate, anger, annoyance are a whole lot easier to identify. So that's why pseudo-love is further from love, because it's harder to identify. So this love, as we said, is characterized by cruelty, for example, violence, disrespect, revenge, aggressiveness, resentment, hate, annoyance. By indifference, passiveness, when we don't care what could have been to other people. Could have been here is the idea of what could happen to other people, what I could have done better. When we are completely passive. It's not my problem. And those, both cruelty and indifference, as time goes by, and it could be in the same existence or it could be a few existences later, it invariably is going to lead us to guilt. So we're going to have what we call conscience anxiety. Our conscience is going to become very anxious because the moment, sometimes we realize consciously, but sometimes it's subconsciously, and it just comes as a feeling of anxiety. And it takes the person from one extreme to the other. So if I were an absolutely cruel person, or an indifferent person, The moment I start to awaken my conscience and realize, either completely consciously or sometimes subconsciously, in the feeling of the conscience anxiety, I am going to try to overcompensate. And when we try to overcompensate is usually when we end up back in the pseudo love, which again brings us further from real love. Because then we are going to start to make not real efforts to change, but we're going to start to act in sort of a desperate way, sort of a desperate manner. And all of us have already been in that phase of both cruelty and indifference to different degrees, different intensities for centuries. And usually right after a long period of indifference or cruelty, we end up falling in the guilt and trying to overcompensate. So when we talk about pseudo-love is the obligation to love our neighbors. So again, we try to overcompensate and we fall into pseudo-love, where we feel we have an obligation. So it's a masked face of the ego. Pseudo-love, sentimentalism, feeling of pity, desire to solve other people's problems. So again, we overcompensate. Instead of having a true attitude of love, we want to live other people's lives for them. And many times in our family cells or in our romantic or spousal relationships, a lot of times the people who are connected to us are people who have these spirits, who have this kind of relationship, that we've been either the perpetrators or the victim of both cruelty and indifference. And we are here to learn to love ourselves. But when that conscious anxiety hits us, we try to overcompensate. So like parents overprotecting their children, spouses trying to live the other spouse's life, trying to solve all the problems without letting the person think for themselves, solve their own problems. So, and also this feeling of pity. This is something that we always work with the kids, the difference between pity and the feeling of charity. When I pity someone, I feel superior. I'm looking down at the person saying, oh, poor person. So when I pity someone, I'm feeling that I'm better than they are. I don't really understand or don't try to understand what they're going through. I just feel sorry for them. Meaning I am in a better state, I am in a better position, so, oh, poor you. So again, pity is not an essential feeling. And pseudo virtues are a lot easier to nurture than true virtues. And people like this, people who develop pseudo virtues, they feel uneasy, they feel guilty for the social problems, and they think they have to solve the world's problems. Most of the time, I'm not going to say them, we, because we've all been there. Maybe we are there. So we don't even realize, but we are actually bargaining with God, trying to overprotect, trying to solve all the problems in the world, trying to live other people's lives for them, trying to save them. The savior behavior, the savior feeling, this is all a bargain with God. This is all based on, if I do well now, if I do really well now, then I'll be saved. Then I won't go to hell. Then I won't have a horrible old age. So this is all bargaining with God. And we don't even realize that we're bargaining, that we're trying to overcompensate. So We need to do our best to help people, but without trying to solve their problems. We're all invited to be responsible for our own lives. And again, we are here to try to learn to love each other, not to solve each other's problems, not to live each other's lives. And we can help the other people help themselves. We need to keep our individuality and respect other people's individualities as well. Help them develop responsibility for themselves instead of solving their problems, instead of trying to save them. And this is what will generate true love for our neighbors, because it's based on empathy, compassion, on solidarity. So it's teaching to fish instead of giving the fish, and if you're not around, they starve. That's not the idea. So what is the right way to treat our neighbors? Like, how do we get to treating others the way we would like to be treated? Loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. Again, here we are starting from the point that we have already learned to love ourselves, then moving on. And this is a technique, Victor talked about it a few months ago, I've talked about it a few times, and it's close to my heart because it's something that every now and then I remember, like whenever I identify an egotistic feeling, I go back to this technique. It's a technique that helps me personally very much. There are many other techniques. 2 weeks ago on a Monday talk, I showed a diagram of a cycle, and words are different, but it's similar to this. There are many other techniques, and this is only one of them, but I like it because it's very straightforward. And it's an acronym, and what it means, PARDA, P is for perception or acknowledgement, A is for acceptance, R is for reflection, D is for decision, and the last A is for action. So let's go through them and try to understand how to use this technique. So first, the P for perception. So perception is the first step in the process of changing, because we can't change something that we don't realize. And it's the stage of self-awareness, is in when I stop to think, when I don't try to mask my feelings or my actions. It's important to pay attention to the following issues during the perception phase. This perception is supposed to be kind, free of right or wrong judgment. So at this point, I'm just acknowledging egotistic behavior, egotistic thoughts, egotistic feelings. And it's necessary to understand the difference between your idealized self and your real self. Very, very, very few of us, humankind in general, can truly understand or know who we actually are. Most of us either think we're better than we actually are, or those who have serious self-esteem traumas or psychological issues will think that they're worse than they are. Very few people have a perception of their true selves. So here it's an exercise in trying to understand who we actually are. Not better, not worse, but who we actually are. And this is why no judgment of right or wrong is important. It's just acknowledgement, realization of a feeling, a thought, or an action that we understand is not essential, is not virtuous. So it's just acknowledging, not putting ourselves down, not finding excuses for why, but just realizing. Then the second phase is acceptance, because I can realize it, I can acknowledge, and then later I'm like, I'll mask the feeling or thought or action, and I'll say, no, it's not it. Sweep it under the rug, and I'm done. So the second stage is acceptance. After perception, we are invited to fully, lovingly, and unconditionally accept the egotistic movements. And movement here is either the feeling, the thought, or the action, responsible for our limitations. Acceptance is proactive. It's a proactive virtue that requires an exercise of humility. Again, the feeling of being an apprentice. So I need to be humble enough to understand that it's a learning process in order for us to recognize our limitations. If I already think I'm the best I can possibly be, it will be really hard for me to recognize my limitations. It's necessary to accept that we are still imperfect. Therefore, it's necessary to exercise humility and compassion in order to accept our own limitations. In that case, what can I do to change this limitation? In the book, Jesus Model and Guide for the Family, Jesus Modelo e Guia da Família, there's a whole chapter about this technique with a lot more detail, so I recommend that chapter because this is just a small summary. Over there, it's a whole chapter and it's explained in a lot of details and examples. Then the third, reflection, R for reflection. So I've acknowledged, I've accepted that that's true. I'm not sweeping under the rug. Now, how can I change? So, in the previous one, we asked, what can we do to change this limitation? What can we do to change this feeling, thought, or action? We are invited to reflect fully and consciously upon the questions or matters that we realized in the perception stage. Upon our self-judgment, perfectionism, so reflect upon self-judgment, upon our perfectionism, our self-blame, excuses, and mental laziness that we insist on feeding. It's a whole lot easier to feed these egotistic feelings than to truly and conscientiously reflect on how we can change that. And later we're going to see an example. Then D for decision, because again, this is a technique and there are 5 stages. We can stop at any of them. We can acknowledge or perceive. We can so we can acknowledge or perceive. We can accept that it is that. We can reflect on how we can change it. However, we can make all the plans in the world, but if we don't move on to the next stage, if we don't move on to the decision, they will just be plans that will never come to fruition. So after reflecting, our own conscience invites us, because the divine laws are there, our conscience knows where we should be going. We have the seed to plant and nurture. So our conscience invites us to make a decision about what to do to start working on re-signifying, not sweeping under the rug, not feeling like we have an obligation to do it, but truly transforming. So re-signifying, transforming our egotistic movements. And again, movements, feelings, thoughts, actions. Resignification requires a firm decision towards making all necessary efforts to gradually replace the egotistic movement we are working on, because we have so many, so let's work slowly one at a time, with the loving essential movement. So due to the hard work it takes to carry out the change of habit, because it's not once or twice, it's a habit we need to change, we are invited to develop strong and determined willpower towards change. Without willpower, we're going to fall back into the moral laziness, into the, it's too much work, I'll do it in the next incarnation, I'll do it when I'm older. First, I'm going to live and enjoy life. When I get older, I'll think about being virtuous. So without this willpower, we are just gonna stay where we are and not move forward. And then the last stage for the technique is the action. Once we've made the decision to change, it becomes essential to consciously act in order to slowly and gently replace the egotistic movement with the proactive essential movement. The action of changing will go through 4 stages. So we already went through 5 stages of the Parda technique. When we finally get to the action, when we finally get to how we are truly going to transform, this last phase still has 4 stages. The first one, the acknowledgement of an egotistic movement, we are working on. So let's say we are working on vengeance, on hate, or something like this. So the acknowledgement of this movement, this feeling, thought, or action that we are working on appears after its manifestation. So I only acknowledge the perception phase, the P for the Parda. I only acknowledge, I only perceive after it happens, after I have already felt, thought, or after I did something already. It's a learning accomplishment stage where we learn from our mistakes. So it's already happened, and then I acknowledge, then I realize. The second stage, and here we're talking about going through all 5 phases of the Parda technique. So all these stages are when we go through all of them. It's not just the action, but the whole process. Here we're talking about acknowledgement, which is the first, is the P. So the second stage for learning, for the action phase, is perception starts during the manifestation of the egotistic movement. It starts while I'm feeling, thinking, or doing something, making it possible for the individual to analyze it better in order to overcome or even change it. So when it happens when I acknowledge while it's happening, not after, but while, I also have the option to try and change it right away. Immediately. I can stop the process in the middle. I can stop halfway. Then the third stage. Perception starts before the manifestation of the egotistic movement, making it possible for the individual to choose not to do it or feel or think through proper use of our free will. So again, this is connected to the decision. When we realize during, we can decide to stop, or we can decide if we still feel some kind of joy, of accomplishment feeling by doing that. When it starts before, we can still choose to go ahead and do it, even if we realize before. And then the fourth stage. The individual starts to realize that the manifestations of the egotistic movement that we are working on will become more and more sparse, spaced, until the change is completed. when there are no more manifestations because the egotistic feeling was transformed into an essential virtue. So we're not gonna start feeling, start thinking, start doing something. These feelings are gonna come less and less frequently until they don't come anymore, because we don't have that egotistic feeling anymore. We have already developed the virtue. Extremely important to understand that this is a process that takes time. It's not overnight. Any change that takes place overnight is not a real change. It's a pseudo virtue. And we're going to see an example, right? So how can we resignify these thoughts? Before we act, we think, right? Our actions are usually a translation of our thoughts that came from our feelings. So we can start backwards, right? So first with the actions, again, we can choose not to do it. Then the feelings, and then the thoughts, and then the feelings. So how can we resignify? How can we transform? So here we're going to talk about first the thought that would lead to an action, and what other thoughts could replace them in that process. So we reflect how we can change, what we can do. So in terms of thoughts, how can we replace those thoughts that are not the essential feelings? So here, let's think of an example of the work in the Spiritist Center. Let's think about a volunteer worker who works with children Spiritist education or even evangelization. So today is the day that I'm supposed to go to the Spiritist Center and work with the kids. And then I have the thought, well, for us here in North America, especially Canada, we have a very short summer and we don't get a whole lot of good weather. So let's imagine it's a sunny, beautiful day and I'm supposed to go to the Spiritist Center to work with the kids. And when I wake up, I just think it's a beautiful day outside, it's sunny, and I think, I'll skip today. It won't make any difference. Like if I'm there, if I'm not, like if I don't go, they're gonna find someone to replace me and it's all gonna be fine. So we go back to the feeling of indifference. Not gonna make a difference. I'll be replaced. Somebody will be there, they're gonna call somebody and it's all gonna be fine. And then after this, I'll skip, comes the guilt. But I have to go. It's my obligation. The poor kids need me. So the whole savior thought, right? I have to go. They need me. I have to do charity or I will have problems. I will be a victim of obsession. And this is, again, after indifference or even cruelty. Here, cruelty wouldn't apply. But let's talk about indifference. After we have that thought or feeling of indifference, we try to overcompensate. We have the conscience anxiety. We want to be the savior, right? And we are afraid of what's going to happen to us. So this is a very clear example of the whole bargaining with God. So if I don't do it, something bad's going to happen. So I have to do it for me not to suffer any consequences. So again, how can we resignify these thoughts? What other thoughts could replace these ones? So once we go through the part of technique, I acknowledge, I perceive my thoughts, I accept that I have this egotistic feeling, I reflect on what I can do, and here we are going to talk about the reflection. So how can we change the reflection in order for us to decide and then act. So what kind of thoughts could replace these thoughts? For example, I know I don't feel like going. It's sunny outside, summer is short. I know I would have more fun, more pleasure at the lake, at the movie theater, at the park, at a picnic, anywhere. I know I can use my free will to do that. I can always choose to call and say, oh, sorry, I can't. But I know this is not my commitment for this life. We've talked about this so many times before. I'm going to go over time, sorry. I have a few more slides, just a few more. So we have this commitment, this contract we sign before we reincarnate. We have our reincarnation plan, and nobody's forbidden to have fun. However, it's important to think, is this what I promised myself I was going to do for my own evolution? My conscience tells me to fulfill my duty of solidarity. And here, the word duty is completely different from the word obligation. The duty of my conscience is what I know is better for me. It's not because it's an obligation, but because I know it's what I should do. So my duty of solidarity, that's what I should do. That's why I'm incarnated. Because that will improve myself, and at the same time I will be helping the kids if all goes well. So again, it will improve myself in the first place, and I'll be helping the kids. Self-love, charity. Fulfilling my commitment is the best option right now, even though it's not the most fun. Again, nobody's forbidden to have fun. After the activities are finished, there's still half a day to be enjoyed. Right? So it's not that we can't, it's just, again, is it the best option for me? I can do anything I want, but is it good for me? So this attitude changes the level of essential conscience. It's the true charity because it's the fruit of self-conscience and not pseudo-conscience. I'm not going because I have to. I'm going because I thought about it, I reflected, and I understand, and I feel in my heart that that is the best thing for me to do, both for myself and for those who are involved in the activity. So it's self-conscious. I am aware of the reasons why I am doing that, fully aware. It's necessary to make continuous, patient, perseverant, and disciplined efforts. Again, it's not just once or twice or 20 or 100 times. It takes time and effort. But if God, Jesus, and the superior spirits believe that we can do, why should we doubt ourselves? We shouldn't doubt ourselves, because if the whole spirituality is supporting us and believe that we can do, and we agreed to do it before we incarnated, that's because we can do. It's just a matter of how much we want to do. It's a matter of how much effort we want to put into it. So it completely depends on us. And this talk was based on the books Convites Terapêuticos de Jesus, Filho, Amor Imbatível Amor, like we said, by the Spirit Joana de Angeli, psychographed by Divaldo, and Spirit's book by Allan Kardec. Any comments or questions?
No, just hi from Sonia.
Okay. Hi, Sonia. Thank you. Okay, since there's nothing else, we're going to do our final prayer. I invite everybody to close your eyes. Take a deep breath. can try to feel, try to think. Have I been in contact with my conscience? Have I been answering the questions I ask myself with sincerity? Have I been making real efforts to accomplish what my conscience, what my intuition tells me to do? Dear Father, we ask you for enlightenment, for protection, and for the strength to face our weaknesses, to face our egotistic flaws, with sincerity, and with love, with self-love, without judging, condemning, and punishing ourselves. We ask you for the strength to accept the opportunities we are given. We ask you for the strength to make those patient, perseverant efforts so that we can use our free will properly, so that we can finally sow seeds of virtue in order to reap those virtues as we work to the limit of our strength to collect all the benefits that the law of love, justice, and charity will bring us, to collect all the benefits from learning to love ourselves, learning to love our neighbors and treat them the way we would like to be treated. And finally, as we evolve, learn to fully love our Father. May we all have the opportunities to use the Sparta technique in our daily lives, maybe in a few situations this week, so that we can again go through the path of the narrow door, knowing that what we'll find on the other side is true happiness. May we all have a blessed week and be together for the Talk in Portuguese tomorrow night. So be it. Thank you.